March 3rd, 1944, East Anglia, England. Lieutenant William Overeat gripped his pencil as he wrote to his sweetheart back in Virginia, his hand trembling slightly from exhaustion rather than fear. Tomorrow, we're doing something everyone said was impossible, flying all the way to Berlin and back in a single-seat fighter. The brass kept telling us it couldn't be done. Through his quarters window, he could see ground crews working under floodlights, attaching strange cylindrical objects beneath the wings of his P-51 Mustang. They looked like they were made of cardboard, these new fuel tanks wrapped in brown paper like packages from home. Some of the boys were calling them paper bags. The crew chief had laughed when Overstreet questioned their reliability. They're made of laminated paper and plastic resin, Lieutenant. Same stuff the Brits have been using. They'll hold fuel long enough to get you there and back. The mathematics of aerial warfare were about to be rewritten not by superior firepower or advanced metallurgy, but by compressed paper soaked in resin, manufactured in a converted newspaper plant by workers who normally produce the London Times. The crisis had reached its breaking point on October 14th, 1943, Black Thursday. Colonel Hubert Zicker stood at the operations board at Halesworth, watching the mission reports coming in like casualty lists from the Western Front. 60 B-7 lost, 600 men gone in a single day. Of the 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses sent on the mission to Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories, 60 were shot down by German fighters and flak. Another 17 damaged so heavily they had to be scrapped. The losses represented over 26% of the attacking force. Without fighter escort, the daylight bombing campaign was bleeding to death over Germany. Among the survivors returning to Thorpe Abbotts that day was Technical Sergeant Robert Morgan, ball turret gunner on a B-17 of the 100th Bomb Group. His testimony to intelligence officers was stark. The Jerrys waited until our little friends turned back at Arkin. Then they came at us in waves. Head-on attacks, rockets from twin-engine jobs sitting outside our gun range. We were sitting ducks for 3 hours. The P-47 Thunderbolts, magnificent as they were, could only reach 375 missiles with their standard drop tanks. The German fighters simply waited beyond that invisible line in the sky, then tore into the bomber formations with methodical precision. In a modest office at the 8th Air Force Technical Section at Bovington, Colonel Cass Hough was examining something that looked more like arts and crafts than military hardware. It was a fuel tank made of laminated kraft paper, impregnated with plastic resin, manufactured by Bowater-Lloyd of London, the company that normally produced newsprint for Fleet Street. Hough had spent months developing this unlikely solution to the range problem, working with British engineers who had already been experimenting with non-metallic drop tanks alongside Colonel Bob Schaefer. The British had been driven by different needs. Their metal supplies critically short, every pound of aluminum precious. But Hough saw a different advantage. These paper tanks weighed approximately 50 empty, compared to 150 for the metal versions. That weight savings translated directly into fuel capacity and range. The construction involved multiple layers of kraft paper bonded with resource-nol formaldehyde glue, shaped over wooden forms with internal wooden anti-slush baffles, then coated with fluorescent lacquer and aluminum paint for a distinctive silver appearance. The first combat test came in February 1944, when P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group flew with the British-made 108 paper tanks. Major James Goodson led the mission, later recording in his combat report that the tanks performed flawlessly to Hanover and back, with no leaks or failures, extending range by 125 miles. But this was just the beginning. The transformation accelerated with the arrival of the P-51B Mustang at Debden in late February 1944. Colonel Donald Blakesley's 4th Fighter Group, comprising the 334th, 335th, and 336th Squadrons, received their first Mustangs on February 28th. The pilots had less than 24 hours to transition from their Thunderbolts. Captain Don Gentile, who would become one of the war's top aces, had exactly 45 minutes of flight time in the Mustang before his first combat mission. But it was the marriage of the Mustang and the paper drop tanks that would change everything. The Mustang could carry two 108-gallon paper tanks, manufactured now in increasing numbers at Bowater-Lloyd's plants in Sittingbourne and Kemsley. With these tanks, the P-51's combat radius extended to 850 miles. Berlin, 580 mi from East Anglia, was suddenly within reach. The morning briefing on March 4, 1944 at Debden was electric with tension. Intelligence officer Major John McCulpin pulled back the curtain on the mission map. A red ribbon stretched from their base all the way to Berlin. For the first time in history, single-engine fighters would escort bombers to the enemy capital and back. This 1,100-meter round trip marked a historic milestone that would fundamentally alter the strategic bombing campaign. Captain William O'Brien of the 357th Fighter Group remembered that moment decades later in interviews with Air Force historians. You could hear a pin drop. Then someone whistled Berlin. We were going all the way to Berlin in fighters. The crew chiefs had been filling those paper tanks since 300 hours. They had to be careful. The tanks would only hold fuel for about 5 hours before the gasoline started breaking down the resin. But 5 hours was enough. The engineering behind these paper tanks was deceptively sophisticated. They were constructed in three main components: nose cone, tail cone, and body. The center section consisted of layers of impregnated paper wrapped around a cylinder, while end caps were hand-laminated with petal-shaped pieces called gauze. Each tank could hold 108 US gallons of 100-octane aviation fuel, sometimes listed as 110 gall total, with 108 usable. The tanks measured 100 in long and underwent pressure testing to 6 psi. They had excellent tolerance for extreme heat and cold, functioning from sea level to 40,000 FT in temperatures from 60 to plus 120 degrees F. Workers at Bowater-Lloyd, many of them women who had previously worked in the newspaper industry, along with production at other facilities, including distributed manufacturing in British homes and workshops, produced these tanks in increasing numbers. As 1944 progressed, the American aviation establishment remained skeptical, even as combat operations proved the tank's effectiveness. Right field technical experts declared that paper tanks were absolutely unfeasible and will not do the job for which they are intended. However, by the time this assessment reached England, the 8th Air Force had already used more than 15,000 paper tanks without a single failure attributable to tank construction. Colonel Howe's response was characteristically direct. He continued pushing production forward, knowing that combat results spoke louder than laboratory assessments. The skepticism from right field became irrelevant in the face of operational success. The first escort mission to Berlin on March 4th saw P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts accompany over 700 heavy bombers to the Nazi capital. Leading the Mustangs was Colonel Blakesley, whose pre-mission briefing to his pilots was recorded by intelligence officer Captain John Slater. These paper tanks will get you there and back. When you hit the initial point, punch them off and engage any enemy fighters. Remember, with these tanks, we own the sky all the way to Berlin. The mission was not without losses. The 4th Fighter Group lost Lieutenant Alan Bante, who was shot down by flak near Brandenburg. But the psychological impact on both sides was profound. Luftwaffe pilot Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, flying with Jagdgeschwader 11, recorded in his diary that night his shock at seeing American fighters over Berlin, noting that their intelligence had insisted this was impossible and that everything they had been told was wrong. For the bomber crews, the sight of Mustangs over Berlin was transformative. Ball turret gunner Sergeant Dale Rice of the 100th Bomb Group later testified in official debriefings about approaching the initial point when he saw P-51s at 30,000 FT with contrails streaming. One waggled its wings as it passed over them, and he could see the drop tanks under the wings. The impact was immediate and dramatic. On March 6th, when bombers returned to Berlin with Mustang escort, Luftwaffe interceptions decreased significantly. Major Walter Noatny, one of Germany's top aces with 258 victories, reported to Luftwaffe High Command that the Americans had solved the range problem and that their tactical advantage was gone. The production chain for paper drop tanks exemplified Allied industrial cooperation and innovation. Bowater-Lloyd, which had been producing 60% of British newsprint before the war, converted portions of their facilities at Sittingbourne and Kemsley to tank production. The company's experience with paper lamination and their access to raw materials made them ideal for this work. The kraft paper came from recycled newspapers and packaging materials, while the resource-null formaldehyde glue was produced at Imperial Chemical Industries plants, using materials that didn't compete with other war priorities. The entire production process from raw material to finished tank took approximately 72 hours. Additional production came from distributed manufacturing across Britain, with workers in home workshops contributing to the war effort. The tanks were wrapped in heavy brown paper for shipping and could be transported efficiently, with far more paper tanks fitting in transport aircraft than metal tanks. Master Sergeant Donald Manor of the 357 Fighter Group, responsible for drop tank logistics at Lyon, kept detailed records that survived the war. His team would begin work at 200 hours on mission days, unwrapping tanks, checking seals, and mounting them on aircraft pylons. The mounting system was elegantly simple, with tanks attaching to standard bomb shackles with a quick release mechanism. A pull of a lever in the cockpit would jettison both tanks simultaneously, essential for combat maneuvering. The fuel feed system used the aircraft's existing plumbing, with check valves preventing fuel loss when the tanks were released. The critical limitation was that the resource-null glue would slowly dissolve from the fuel's solvent effects, causing leaks within hours, making these strictly single-use items that had to be filled immediately before takeoff. By May 1944, the impact of long-range fighter escort was measurable in stark numbers. Before the introduction of effective long-range escort, the 8th Air Force experienced catastrophic losses. October 1943 had seen monthly loss rates of approximately 7.6%, with individual missions, like Black Thursday, reaching 20.6%. Once P-51s with drop tanks began regular escort missions, the overall campaign loss rate dropped to between 1.5 and 2.2%. This dramatic reduction saved thousands of aircrew lives and made the strategic bombing campaign sustainable. Technical analysis by Republic aviation engineers revealed unexpected advantages of the paper tanks beyond weight savings. They had better aerodynamics than metal tanks, creating less drag. They were also less likely to explode when hit by enemy fire, as the paper and resin construction would tear rather than fragment. The tanks were partially biodegradable, breaking down within months when left in fields or forests, unlike metal tanks that became permanent hazards to farming. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer, who would end the war with 24 aerial victories, flew the March 6th mission to Berlin. His combat report, preserved in the National Archives, provides detailed pilot perspective on the paper tank's performance at altitude. He took off at 10:45 hours with two 108-gal paper drop tanks, experienced perfect fuel transfer throughout the flight, released tanks at 13:47 hours near Wittenberg when bounced by FW-19s, and engaged immediately after release. The weight difference after dropping the tanks dramatically improved aircraft performance. He shot down one FW-190, damaged another, and returned to base with 45 gallons remaining. Without those paper tanks, he noted, they would have turned back at Brunswick. The strategic impact extended beyond just bomber protection. With extended range, American fighters could conduct fighter sweeps deep into Germany, attacking airfields, rail yards, and targets of opportunity. Colonel Hough, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, conducted a tactical analysis in May 1944 that concluded the extended range provided by British paper tanks had fundamentally altered the air war, allowing them to seize the initiative completely. German response to the Allied range advantage was documented in captured records after the war. A technical intelligence report from Mesmet, AG dated May 15, 1944, acknowledged that the enemy was using disposable fuel tanks of revolutionary construction with laminated paper and phenolic resin impregnation. They had attempted to duplicate this technology, but lacked the industrial infrastructure for mass production. The German attempt to copy paper tank technology failed not for lack of technical knowledge, but due to systemic problems in their war economy. They lacked paper production capacity, with most German paper mills converted to producing military maps and documentation. The resin materials were prioritized for aircraft construction. Most critically, they lacked the distributed manufacturing model that made Allied production so resilient. The Luftwaffe's senior leadership understood the implications immediately. In post-war interrogations, high-ranking Luftwaffe officers acknowledged the strategic impact of long-range fighters. While the specific quote often attributed to Hermann Göring about seeing Mustangs over Berlin cannot be verified in primary sources, documented testimony from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey shows he stated that long-range Allied fighters delivered a major strategic blow to German planning and were one of the most decisive factors in the ultimate outcome. He acknowledged that when fighters appeared over Berlin, the results would be, in his words, tragic for Germany. General Jagdflieger Adolf Galland similarly testified that American fighters ranging over all of Germany with impunity had effectively broken the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy. By June 1944, paper drop tanks had become standard equipment for fighter operations. Sergeant James Patterson, quartermaster at Duxford, maintained logistics records showing that paper tanks required 1/10 the shipping space of metal tanks when transported from factory to airfield. A single C-47 transport could carry hundreds of flattened paper tanks compared to 40 metal tanks. This efficiency meant forward airfields in France, after D-Day, could be supplied by air, maintaining operational tempo even when ground supply lines were stretched. The environmental impact, though not a consideration at the time, was documented by French farmers after the war. Metal tanks that littered fields, killed cattle, damaged plows, and required extensive cleanup lasting years. Paper tanks dissolved in rain over winter, leaving only metal fittings that could be sold for scrap. Captain Donald Bryan of the 302nd Fighter Group experienced one of the rare tank failures on July 18, 1944, the only documented case in his squadron. The port tank developed a leak at 25,000 Ft over Hanover, losing about half the fuel before he could switch it off. He still made it home with fuel to spare from the starboard tank, demonstrating the redundancy built into the system. Technical improvements continued throughout 1944. Second-generation paper tanks featured improved resin formulations that extended fuel storage time from 5 hours to 12 hours, allowing permission preparation the night before and reducing ground crew workload during critical pre-dawn hours. The tanks also received better cold weather treatment, preventing fuel line freezing at high altitudes. The D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, showcased the complete transformation that drop tanks had enabled. Fighter bombers with paper drop tanks ranged far inland, disrupting German reinforcements hundreds of miles from the beaches. Captain Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group flew 3 missions on D-Day, each time with paper drop tanks, allowing him to loiter over the battlefield for extended periods. The ability to provide continuous fighter cover over the invasion beaches and deep into France proved crucial to the success of Operation Overlord. Production statistics from mid-1944 show the scale of the operation. British factories were producing thousands of paper drop tanks monthly, with Bowater-Lloyd as the primary manufacturer, supplemented by other facilities. The entire Allied fighter force in Northern Europe could be equipped with fresh tanks for every mission. Metal tank production, by comparison, remained limited by aluminum availability and required critical resources needed for aircraft production. Colonel Francis Gabreski, leading ace of the European theatre with 28 victories, flew his most successful mission on July 5, 1944, using paper drop tanks. Leading the 61st Fighter Squadron to Magdeburg, he shot down 3 Messerschmitt Bf-109s after dropping his tanks near Brandenburg. His after-action report noted perfect tank performance at 30,000 FT, despite -40-degree temperatures, clean release when bounced by enemy fighters, and critical improvement in climb rate after release. By September 1944, the Luftwaffe day fighter force was effectively broken. General Galland reported to Hitler that American fighters were ranging over all of Germany with impunity. The long-range escort had not only protected bombers, but had engaged in systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe through aggressive fighter sweeps. German pilot training programs, forced to operate from scattered fields to avoid attack, produced pilots with fewer than 50 hours of flight time, compared to 400 hours for American pilots. First Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361 Fighter Group achieved a remarkable feat on October 7, 1944. Flying with 2 108 paper tanks, he escorted bombers to Polit near the Polish border, a round trip of 400 mm. After dropping his tanks, he shot down 2 Su-62 jets, becoming one of the first pilots to down the revolutionary German fighters. The efficiency of paper tank logistics became crucial during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. With forward airfields hastily constructed and supply lines strained, the lightweight compact paper tanks could be delivered by light aircraft or even parachute drop. Captain Jack Ilfrey, commanding the 20th Fighter Group, documented surge operations during the Bulge, noting they flew 3 missions on December 23rd, each time with fresh paper tanks, with ground crews able to rearm and refuel, including mounting new tanks in 20 minutes. German technical intelligence officer Major Wilhelm Hoffmann, captured in April 1945, provided post-war testimony about the impact of Allied drop tanks to U.S. interrogators. He stated that they tracked every innovation in Allied fighter capability, and the appearance of paper drop tanks was more strategically significant than any new aircraft type. It meant nowhere in the Reich was safe from fighter attack. Their entire air defense strategy, based on concentric rings of fighter bases, became obsolete overnight. The numbers from the Strategic Bombing Survey were conclusive. In 1943, before widespread use of long-range escort, German fighter production had actually increased despite bombing. By late 1944, with Mustangs ranging over every German factory, fighter production dropped.